Hello and welcome to this video on action. We are going to be focusing predominantly on this creative tool in this section. We're not going to touch on probably a fraction of all the creative tools that are inside there, but this yet again is just to give you an idea of what action is, how you could use it on day-to-day compositing tasks, and some of the tools that are available for you. The main thing is we're going to try and get some concepts across to you and also some sort of like general navigation and orientation of what action is and how to use it. So we got my action dragged out from my batch tool bin down here, and we want to start populating that with media. Now, by default, the only input we have is the background input, and then we use the background input for some specific tasks. It's basically unaffected by camera movements. It's a very 3D concept. You can pan the camera around, which will never affect the background. It's kind of a fixed, locked entity. But if you want to start doing compositing, chances are you probably want to start populating this with media layers, so media coming in. So here we have two pieces of media we're going to use for our composite today, just to get you some concepts, and we want to get those in. So if we come down into the actual action menu down here, you can see that there's actually quite a lot of sections. There's a tool bin, there's a media list, which is going to be populated when we start inputting some media. There's object controls when we start manipulating objects as well as outputs and analyzers and things like that. So we could add new inputs by just tapping this button. That's a little bit of a drag. So what we're going to do is going to use a hotkey. So we're going to do Control N. That's going to pop out an input node, as it were, with a front and a mat. We can use external mats. And we're going to connect our first piece of media in. And straight away, you can see that this is now populated my action environment. We've got something coming in. The representation is that this is the actual size of the media coming in. And this is actually my current action resolution, which is 1920 by 1080. We're going to pop in another piece of media as well. I'm going to bring in this one. And you can see that has now come into the scene as well. So what we need to do from here is really sort of get over the concept that we now have two schematics. So we have this batch schematic we're in. If we select the action and hit the tilde key underneath the escape key, that's going to take me into my action schematic. So I know we seem to be quite schematic heavy, but we're going to need this because the way that action works is very much object orientated. Okay, we're working with these objects in a 2D or a 3D space. So spacebar pans around, control spacebar will zoom. And for the viewport, that will do the same thing. We can spacebar and control spacebar to pan and zoom the images in there. Now, and because this is potentially a 3D environment as well, we've got some other controls and some other views that we can use in this viewport. So just to start off with, we're going to be selecting some of our objects. So this is our background at the moment, which is obscured by a foreground. Now, once again, there's contextual menus, so you can right-click on any of these objects and you can see what's available. One of those tools is the ability to be able to hide layers or show layers. So we can actually hide objects very quickly in our scene. But what we want to look at first really is navigating in the 3D workspace. So over in this view, there's a couple of hotkeys. If you get kind of lost or you forget them, always remember you've got the viewing drop down. You can always find what you need inside of there. For this, you're going to be needing the Action 3D views. You've got working camera default front, side and top. So I come to this viewport and do spacebar A. I'm just going to frame this up to 100%. We've got some navigation tools. We're now in our working camera, so we can navigate freely around our 3D environment. Alt is going to allow me to orbit around the camera. Now you can see we've got some Z fighting here. So what we're going to do is we're going to select our background and we're just going to kind of move it away so it's not occupying the same part of space. Control and Alt will zoom or dolly in the viewport, and Alt and Shift will allow me to pan around. So Alt, Alt Shift, Control Alt gives you your three main movements inside the scene. The representation here is an axis. An axis basically is controlling the objects in space. Now, if we double tap on this, it will bring me to my object bar, my action. You can see there that I can use these sliders to manipulate the objects, X, Y, Z, rotation, scale, etc. However, we can also do that directly in the viewport as well. So we have some different orientations for the icons. At the moment we're on world, but we can come down to make it object, which will make a bit more sense when we look at rotation. But essentially T to move things around, R to rotate things around, and E will scale either proportionally or non-proportionally depending on what you grab on. Now, if you make a complete mess like I've just done here, and you actually want to quickly reset one parameter, all parameters, you can come down to the object list here. You could say Control Tap, reset the X, or actually if I come to the axis, do a right click, I can reset the whole axis in one go. So everything really to the middle of this bar is controlling the positional aspect of the objects in space. And then everything to the right is really to do with what we call the surface. So for us, that would be things like transparency, and I like our blending modes as well, on how it blends with other objects in the scene. It's also going to control things called the surface properties. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to select my background for a moment. I'm just going to hide that to make things a little bit more obvious. I'll come back to my foreground, and I'm going to change it from flat to bilinear. Now, what this allows me to do now is I can actually now distort this in space. So I'm doing like a corner pin operation, but you see if I orbit around, I can actually distort it in 3D space as well. So if I had some lights in the scene, or if I had some textures and things, they will obviously be affected at the same time. We have a different reaction on the lighting depending on how I'm manipulating it in space. Another one I can use is actually a thing called a perspective. Now, if we go to our camera result view for a moment, just to sort of pan back a little bit, if we go back to bilinear and we kind of select these points, you can kind of see that we're sort of distorting this in space, okay? Which makes sense. And the more we sort of wibble it around, the more distorted it looks. If we change this bilinear to a perspective, you can see that we get a slightly different representation, right? Moving and manipulating the points is really sort of taking into account the perspective in the scene, whereas a bilinear is kind of distorting the plate. So subtle differences, but they have their place when you're kind of doing corner pinning and stuff like that. Once again, if you make a complete mess of it, you can right click on here and you can actually reset the surface back to default. If we go back to our camera view for a moment, and we kind of dolly in a little bit on there, just orbit it. The last one we've got is one called Extended by Cubics. And Extended by Cubics is a lot like bilinears, except you're going to see here that we have things like tangents. We actually can go through and we can really shape that surface exactly how we want it to behave. So we could make it sort of concave. This is particularly good, you know, when we're manipulating textures or surfaces we need to fit into something else. It's just a useful tool. If we go down to the vertices, you can also then go through and subdivide or merge those. So you have extra vertices by which you can further distort objects in space. So it's quite a creative tool. And obviously when we get some lighting in the scene, that's going to interact with the lighting quite nicely. So once again, we're just going to go through and quickly reset that, and we're going to change it back now to a flat surface. So as you can see, the manipulation is kind of fairly fluid inside of the action environment. If we just turn on our background for a second, what we really want to do though is kind of probably start working with objects. In this particular case, we're just going to composite one of these against another. So we're going to come back to our camera view for a moment and see how we can actually use some of the tools inside here to perform that. But first, I want to focus a little bit more on these axes. So let's hide this for a moment. We're going to take my axes here. We're just going to shrink this particular layer down, and we're going to move it over to one side. Now, this is going to bring me back to my media list here. So my media list gives me a list of all the available inputs that I've kind of got coming into the scene. So that means that I can actually drag in more instances into the scene here. So you can see I've just dragged in the same one again. We go to my object menu, and I'm going to scale that down and kind of move it over. Now, that's okay, but sometimes, you know, maybe you want to work a little bit more fluid, a little bit more economically. You don't want to have lots and lots, especially if it's the same plate, if you're making like a video wall or if you're doing some kind of just graphics, okay? So these axes are actually really kind of quite useful. If we disconnect this for a second by drawing a line through, you can see that the image plane comes up front and center again. But if we reconnect it, it obeys the positional information of the axis. Now, if we go down to our tool bin for action, these are all the tools that we can use. They're categorized down as well. So we've got matchbox effects tools, lightbox tools, objects, surfaces, maps, and relighting. A whole bunch of stuff. We're not going to get anywhere near looking at all that. But you can see that we can actually bring out more axes into our scene just loose. And when we do that and we actually start connecting it to the same surface, we actually then have instances of that surface very quickly. So if we just hook this one up as well, and we're just going to scale that one down, we're going to kind of move it, you can see that very quickly we can build up multiple instances of an object just by hooking up another axis. Now the benefit of this is that, you know, because they're all sourcing off of one image, if we come down and did something to this particular image, and in this particular case we're going to do something really obvious, like we're going to do an extended by cubic, and we're going to try and select one of those points and we distort it, you can see obviously it's distorting all of them because it's actually the same source. So sometimes this is a very useful way of kind of manipulating and sort of structuring out your scene. The other thing is, well, that you can start building then hierarchies if you need to control multiple objects with a master axis by bringing out another one, kind of hooking that up. These are all still independent, so you know we can go through and we can kind of, you know, scale and rotate and do crazy stuff to each of these individually. Which is what we're doing. I'm going to do that one. I'm going to do something like this. And then there you go, something like that. That master axis then is going to obviously control everything in one go. All right, so you can see how quickly you can build up a hierarchy that easily controls multiple objects. And when you're doing compositing, especially in 3D space, that is a real bonus. So let's quickly delete all of these, just holding down the D key. I'm going to come back to here. I'm going to reset this completely, so we're now back at 100%. So we can see that we can drag multiple objects in. We can see that we can work in a 3D environment in space. What we like to do next is see about some of the tools that's going to allow me to composite these images together. So we looked briefly at Gmasks in the previous video, and obviously you've got mats and masks as well. But what's nice inside of here is that we can actually bring Gmasks out, well, actually a whole bunch of tools, into the context of the 3D environment, into the 3D composite directly, which is amazing. So back down in my node bin, we're going to do a search for Gmask, hit G on the keyboard. We're going to bring that Gmask out into our scene. I'm going to go back to my camera view for a second, and I'm just going to very quickly draw kind of like a spline, like a mask, something like this, from the camera's point of view into my scene. And when I've done that, if I come back to my perspective view, you can see that what I've actually got here is I've got a mask that lives in space, which is actually cutting a massive hole through everything. We can actually move it forward in space, so this is really good. You can attach it to trackers, you can attach this to camera analyzers as well. It's a really useful tool, but it's a weird concept initially because depending on where you're looking at it from, it will only cut a big hole of transparency from the point of view that you're at. So at the moment, that's probably not much good to me because it's affecting everything in the scene. And actually all I want to do is cut out a hole to see my background behind it. So what's nice about this is that in my tool chest for action, you can see here that it's expanded out quite a lot since we've been inside this module. And once again, the tool chest reacts to the actual tool that you're in. So in action, there's lots of tools. We've got up here a thing called a Gmask link, and that's going to allow me to drag out a connection, so it's only going to affect this layer. It's not going to affect anything else in the scene. So once again, when we kind of orbit around now, you can see that that is the only object that is being cut out. Now, if we select our Gmask, once again, there's lots of tools inside of here as well that we can use. If we go to Add Points for this, and we hold down Shift, I can now go through and I can add like a little bit of softness. We get like a softness gradient. I can add multiple points of softness around. So once again, from our camera point of view, I can now start to see inside my scene what I'm kind of working with. Now, obviously, what we'd like to do is to manipulate both these objects now together. At the moment, they're independent, so we could kind of like move like one object separately from the mask, which, you know, once again, is also kind of quite handy. But it would be nice if they were both ganged together. So we're going to go back to my node bin. We're going to drag out another axis, hold down Shift, and now we've got a master axis that is going to be basically controlling both of those layers, which is kind of good. This is what I want. My background, I'm just going to sort of play around with the scaling a little bit so we can actually sort of see my starfish. And then from there, by coming back to my Gmask, I can go through a little bit more and I can kind of manipulate my mask just to get like a nice feather edge. So we're kind of cutting through that area. So you can see the benefits of being able to sort of like doing compositing in context. We're actually doing your sort of like your masking in context of your scene. I know this is not going to look spectacular, but you get the idea. So now we've cut one thing out from another. Now, because we're working in this in 3D environment, as it were, there's other objects that we can bring into our scene. So let's go down to our node bin again, and we're going to hit L for lights. And this means that we can actually now drag out a light into my scene. So if we look at our working camera view again, you can see that what I've got is a light, and depending on the position and space of that light, we're either going to light one object, no objects, or all of the objects accordingly. And once again, the light has multiple functions. You know, we can go through, we can change the spread of that, we can change the softness of that, we can cast shadows from it, we can change it into shape lights, directional box lights, etc. So much. But what we'd actually like to do is use this as a creative tool inside of Action here to go through, relight, and probably recolor or color correct some of these plates. All right, so we're actually looking at how we can combine these objects together. So in this particular case, I want this light to only affect one object. So if we just kind of, where should we move this? Let's move that one over there for a second. And let's bring my light here. We're going to go to my tool chest, not my options. We're going to go to my tool chest. We're going to pick up a light link, and we're going to link it to this. And you can see now that this light is only affecting that surface. It's not affecting the background at all. So I now have individual control over my layers and how they're going to look. So if I brought out another light into here, and once again I'll go to my light link, and I'm going to hook up to this one. You see at the moment it's lighting both. If I do this, it's now going to be selective to background. Now I've got a separate light that I can use just to light my background scene. I can just bring those right out in space at the moment, just so they're kind of lighting evenly. So looking from my my camera perspective point of view, looking through my camera, this is going to give me a great deal of control. So you can see here that on this light I can say, well, you know, maybe the intensity is just a little bit too much or not enough. This one, it's quite bright in the background, so maybe we could take that down. You see we can do a whole bunch of things. We can make it sort of black and sort of start tinting it and do weird and wonderful things. But what's really useful about this is that we can actually apply more operators to these lights. So coming back to my node bin, if we go to Lightbox, Lightbox is a bunch of tools that are specifically made to attach to lights and then sort of project effects or color corrections, a whole bunch. We can read all these that you've got down here. We can actually just cast effects, but most of these are creative color look development tools. So we're going to keep this nice and simple, and we're going to bring out a color correction Lightbox tool. You can see appearance onto this one. We're going to double tap on that, and now we've got control over masters, shadows, midtones, and highlights, our gamma, offsets, and our color as well. So if we start sort of playing around with this one, you can see that we can affect that. We're going to do exactly the same for our background element as well. We're going to bring out a color correct Lightbox, and we're going to play around with sort of like some of our master offsets, so we can just actually sort of take that down a little bit, maybe just sort of like saturate it up, make it look really sort of tropical beach. But you notice that it's working independently. You know, and maybe the bottom one, I maybe just want to sort of put like a little bit of gain on this, and then we'll sort of bring out, let's take the hue round so it's a bit more golden. Let's take our gain back down for a second. So it's just sort of like warming up the foreground a little bit. And once again, to hide these effects, just hit H, and you can see that we're kind of controlling now very locally what we want to work with. And once again, you know, from there, you know, we could, by manipulating the position of our light in space, we could sort of then, you know, be kind of selective. We could sort of start to draw the attention of the viewer into a particular area. Once again, we can sort of play around with a little bit of a master gain, something like that. But you can see that straight away we're sort of changing the look and feel by using lights and color correction inside of our scene. Now, before we'd sort of going in and out of the batch schematic, you'd be adding operators in this pipeline, then coming back into action and see what the result is. So the benefit of working in context with these tools is quite significant. Right, it's going to speed up your compositing time. It's going to make things a lot more creative, and you can solve a lot more problems as you go along. Now we can also attach effects to the media layers as well. So at the moment you can see that this is effectively going to be my new background, and maybe because the starfish is right close and we have a ridiculous amount of depth of field, we want to sort of blur that out a bit. So if we come down to our node bin, we look at our matchbox bin here, and we're just going to bring out a blur tool. This kind of attaches up to my geometry. Now what happens is that when we attach one of these matchbox effects, it's going to pop out a diffuse texture, because this is actually a piece of geometry textured with this image, and it's going to attach that tool there. So once again, if we kind of zoom in a little bit, now we have a blur node on there. We can go through and we can sort of add some sort of subtle defocus onto my background. We can play around with how this transitions through. We can kind of grab hold of our sort of spline and we can play around with that, so we get a nice smooth transition of where the blur is. But you're kind of getting the idea of merging things together by using masks, by using lights and color correctors, and using effects on those nodes. Now we can actually go one step further on all this, because on the actual camera we have a whole set of plugins that work on a camera or scene basis. So when we're in our matchbox tool bin, pretty much any of these can be applied, and we can, once again, you can have multiple effects bolted onto lights, multiple effects bolted onto these surfaces, as well as camera as well. But if we wanted to do something like a vignette or some chromatic aberration, well, you know what, we can actually just kind of drag that out, put that actually onto my camera, and now everything in my scene is going to be affected by chromatic aberration as seen through the camera. So we can just add a little bit of that, just give that sort of like in vogue sort of defocused look, as it were. And maybe if you kind of look back here as well, if you get our vignetting tool, and we can kind of hook that in, and then straight away you can kind of see that we can sort of play around with the whole look of the scene by attaching effects to the camera. Right, so this is really powerful. This is a really powerful way of working. The more you get into working with action, the more you're going to kind of appreciate how fluid, flexible, and creative it really is working in that environment. Now, of course, we're working with static images here. These obviously can be moving, but this gives you a fundamental idea of how you're going to start bolting images together and kind of working with them in that action environment. The other thing we predominantly use action for is tracking and match moving. Okay, so we've got some examples to save a bit of time, but I'm going to step you through, the typical examples of what you want to do through tracking, match moving, that sort of thing. So let's go back out to my my batch schematic, and we're going to look at this plate to start with. So this is a good example for two things. This is a good example for tracking something into a plate and also sort of stabilizing a plate as well. Once again, this is from the HollywoodCameraWork.com. So they've got loads of tracking, loads of green screen examples, match moving. It's a good site. Go and check it out. I'm going to give you a link at the end of all these videos for all the footage and stuff that we've been using. But just to practice on, if you haven't got your own footage, it's a great resource. So I've already brought this into an action, as it were. It's in my media list. Now, we're going to look at two things here. We're going to look at actually tracking an object on, but we're also going to look at stabilizing. So we're going to try and do two things at once here, save a little bit of time. Come back into our tool bin. We're going to bring out an axis, and it's not going to be attached to anything, which is kind of strange. But what we're actually going to be using is we're going to be using this plate here as a reference for my axis tracker. Okay. So if we go into the object tab here and we go down to tracking, you can see that we have a dedicated tracking interface. You've got track, stabilize, and planar. We're going to be looking at the tracking node here to do both of those purposes. You could still use a stabilizer, but there's a nice little feature in the axis tool that allows you to invert the transformation quite quickly. We can also track off of any piece of media in our scene. So we're using media slot number 1, which is going to be our background. And because we want to actually track an object onto this, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be tracking position by default and also now rotation. So when we enter our tracker, we will have two tracking boxes. Now, a nice little quick tip to manipulate these is if you just hold down the control key, you can tap in the interface and you can then position your reference box and tracker together. We're going to now work on tracker number 2. Hold down the control key and we're going to put it there. We've got some nice tools to manipulate the reference and the search areas together. So if we gang them together, we can kind of make the width and the height of the search area a bit bigger, and the width and the height of the reference area. Now, once we're kind of happy that this looks pretty good, all we have to do is hit analyze. It's as simple as that. Okay, there's no complicated setups inside of here. The tracker is amazingly good inside of Flame. So just going to hit analyze. It's going to go off and do its thing despite all the blurring and everything else. And now you can see that we've got some pretty good tracks. And don't worry, if you do lose a track, it's really simple to stop. You can isolate a tracker, restart it, etc. Now, if we return back into our action schematic, you're going to see now what we have is we have an axis that's going to be kind of tracked on for position and also rotation. It's matching those background markers. And all I really have to do now is attach that to the object that I want to match in. So if we come to our node bin, I'm going to dig out a 3D text tool. We're going to make that a little bit bigger. I'm going to change the text to say something like coffee. There you go. Awesome. Now, of course, at the moment that is not moving, but if we connect all that tracking data up to this object, you now can see that it's going to snap onto that location, and it's now going to sort of track and rotate according to the motion that we've got. So it's really simple. And once again, doing things like 4-point corner tracking is really just an extension of that. We'd get a bicubic, we'd have a tracker on each corner, and you'd just be tracking those in. However, there's a much easier and simpler way to do typical corner pinning operations, which we're going to look at in just a couple of minutes. So that's sort of tracking something on, but what happens if I actually wanted to stabilize that plate out? Well, actually I can use this same axis to do exactly the same process. So we're just going to separate that out for a second. We're just going to hide out my text because I don't really need that. And what we're going to do is we're going to take all that tracking information and we are going to attach it to our background plate. Now, a couple of things happen. We're snapping this up to the location of the axes. But don't worry, we can kind of sort that out. If we come back to our axis here, we can actually adjust the offset to bring the plate back to center. So now we kind of reset the plate. We've still got our tracking information in place, but we actually want to invert that transformation. We want to kind of affect this so that it's actually trying to stabilize the plate out. So in my axis controls, I can just hit invert, and now as we kind of play through, it's doing a darn good job of stabilizing the position and the rotation of that image despite all that kind of blur that we've got going on. So this is kind of like a good introduction on how you would use a standalone axis to do like positional rotation and scaling operations, or in fact you could use that same tracked axis to do a stabilization process, and then out of this particular action you could then go and pass that downstream for whatever work you need to do. Action doesn't have to be the endpoint for all of your composites. You can have multiple actions throughout your batch. So this next example we're going to look at is slightly different. If we kind of play through the footage, you can see that we've got quite a lot of distortion on this. He's moving it around. So like a point tracker is really not going to cut the mustard on this at all. We're going to need to be a little bit more inventive on what we use. So if we come inside of our action scene, we've got some flowers we're going to sort of track on there a bit later, but how are we actually going to go through and track this object? Well, we're going to be using a planar tracker, and we're also going to be using a Gmask to kind of control the region of interest which we want to track. So first off, in our tool bin, we're going to just hit G for Gmask. We're going to bring out a Gmask here, and we're very quickly going to go through and sort of draw a rough shape around the object that we want to track. So this is going to be quite rough and ready. Something like that. That's pretty good. And then we're just going to close that up. I want my axis to be in the center of the rotation, so I can fix that very quickly by offsetting and recentering my axis to my shape. And then what I want to do next is I want to actually now use that mask as a tracker. So if I go into my axis node here, and I come down to my object, I'm going to select my planar tracker. Now we've got a couple of specific view modes for this, which you can find in the Action Schematic View menu. But essentially, I'm going to select F8 on my keyboard, and that is going to take me to a particular reference that I want to use. Now down here, I can actually select the input that I want to use as a reference, which is going to be my background plate, F8. Remember, I can track from any piece of media that's contained within the media list. And I'm going to set a couple of conditions as I go through and track it. If we have kind of a look at this, you can see that there's some big changes in the lighting, so we need to account for that. I want to track the perspective. I want to pre-warn the tracker there's going to be lighting changes, and I want to analyze the RGB channels. And now when I snap it, I get all those conditions taken into account in my tracker. So all I have to do here is hit the Analyze button and let it go through and analyze that motion. And you can see what's happening is that it's on a frame-to-frame basis, it's kind of working out how it can distort to match up the original reference that we gave it when we hit snap. Now when that process is finished, we've got a fairly good track on there, and we're going to go back to my my result view, my F4 view, and we're just going to go to a top view, Shift F4, and you can see from the camera's point of view here, as we play through, this is actually not only sort of transforming in X, Y, and Z space, but also in Z. We're actually also in sort of like Z space backwards and forwards towards the camera. So it's actually taking into account the perspective shift of those objects. So come back to my result view for a second. Now what I need to do, I've got my tracking data on there, is just attach the object I want to use. So I'm actually going to just separate out a flower here. Now we're just going to unhide that for a moment. I'm just going to turn my Gmask off so it's not going to be cutting a hole. And then we're just going to sort of scale this down a little bit, kind of move it up. And then you're going to see that when we actually hook the axis up with all the tracking information, we get a better idea of where it's going to sit. We can go through now. We can kind of position it up just to sort of cover that. We're sort of covering a face, which is a bit unfortunate, but I just want to cover all the green. If I had a bit more time, I would sort of paint that out, but you get the idea. So now what we have when we play through is we have a good solid track that is very sort of believably moving in the perspective and everything else as that woman is sort of waving around the big green card. So that's kind of like a good introduction to looking at planar tracking in the concept of how we can use axes to get that data and transfer it onto another object by using a Gmask as our region of interest tracker. So that's pretty powerful. Now, of course, not all tracks are as easy as that, and our next example here is probably a good example of, when things go wrong. So if we have sort of pre-built some of this just to save a little bit of time, but if we look at this, you can see obviously the problems are is that we've got tracking locators on this, but for most of the time you've got the talent is moving their hand across it, so you're kind of blocking a lot of them. Now we can kind of actually be quite flexible with our tracker. So if we're going to kind of go in here for a moment, I've got some objects that are kind of pre-hidden, but I just want to quickly talk you through what I've done with these Gmasks again. So I started off by sort of just drawing a central Gmask here with my axis center the rotation of the object. And then what I've done, I've just copy and pasted it so that I've got multiple masks around my object. So you can see I've got in the corners, I've got a little bit over the hand, and I've got one on the bottom corner here as well. Now the reason I've got one on the hand here is that it's actually one of the areas that doesn't really get obscured all the way through. The middle one does a bit and the bottom one does, and the top two are fairly clear. But what's nice about this is that we can actually warn the tracker to take into account those occlusions. So once again, we're going to go into my axes, we're going to go into a tracking tab, and we're going to go down to planar tracker. In this view, we're going to go to my F8 view, and we actually want to be using media slot number 1, I think it is. No, media slot 0 to start off with. That's going to be our tracking reference, our background coming in. Now, I'm not going to track perspective on this. There's not actually that much kind of moving in perspective, but I do want to warn it against occlusions, lighting changes, and I do want to analyze the RGB. So once again, if I go now to snap, you can see that I've got a multi-pattern track in effect. I've got those areas that I've isolated with the garbage masks. So all I really have to do now is hit analyze on this, and you're going to go and see what's going to happen. Even though the hand is coming through some of these objects, because we've pre-warned the tracker that there will be occlusions throughout the scene, it's by and large going to ignore those. As long as we've got like a couple of 3 good trackers on that object that are solid, we're going to maintain the tracking integrity. We're going to record the position, the scaling, rotation and skew of that object. You can see as this kind of updates, even when the hand sort of obscures it, it disappears, but then when they can start to reacquire the track, they start to pop back up again. So a really intelligent tracking system that's going to get you out of a ton of trouble for sure. So once that's finished, we can kind of look at our tracking and go, yeah, that's pretty good. We're going to go back to our result view for a second, and we're just going to turn off all of these masks for a moment. We can actually double duty these. We can actually kind of use these to mask some things out, but I'm just going to turn them as being inactive. So from here, what we're going to put in, we haven't got a phone screen, but I do have some color bars that I brought in from the outside world. And this is going to be what I'm going to be using to sort of fake my screening. So all I have to do, similar to before, is just basically bring that in, attach that onto there, and you can see there that straight away we've got that sitting kind of nicely in situ. So the thing I need to fix now is I obviously need to get my hand talent back in on top. So this was originally a green screen, so we've gone through, we've used the master key again. It's not a particularly great key because I say it's quite compressed, this media, but you're going to get the idea. Done a bit of a pixel spread on this as well. When we go back into action, we're just going to bring that on top of everything to sort of restore some of the hand. But you can see fairly quickly, and obviously you would go through and tidy up the tracking marks because at the moment they're being missed out by the green screen, but you get the proof of concept that now what we've got is a pretty good darn track. The talent has been kind of restored up on top, and we could go through and then substitute those bars for an actual interactive phone screen as well. But just to give you an idea, that's just how we would use multiple trackers to then go through and kind of solve this particularly problematic track. Okay, so we've done some point tracking, we've done some object tracking with planar trackers, we've done a lot of tracking, some stabilization. The last thing we'll look at before we wrap this up today is camera tracking, so match moving inside of action. So we're going to try and track this plate. I've done a bit of pre-keying already, and we're going to have a background plate down here which we're going to merge in, and then out of action we've got a couple of outputs where we're going to blend them together. But initially what we want to be doing is seeing how we can get a track inside of action that's going to affect our camera. So down in our sort of like our media list here, we've got the media that's coming in. This is what we want to track. We're going to drag out an analyzer mono, and that's going to build this construct. That's basically the analyzer node, a brand new camera, 3D, and then the footage that we're going to track. So from there, if we double tap on this, it's going to take me down to my camera tracking tab. Now, if you've got some camera measurements, we can obviously feed those in. But by and large, we're just going to let this one auto analyze. Obviously, the more data you have, the better things are. The only thing we really probably want to look at is whether we want to change this from auto detect to pan or tilt, but we're going to leave it auto detect. But I'm just going to increase the number of trackers up to 300. So when I'm kind of happy with this, and once again, if I've got some data, it's going to help. We can hit the analyze button, and essentially the analyzer node is then going to be looking at the movement of the background plate. It's going to be trying to work out from the difference in the parallax motion, going to assign some 2D and extrapolate out some 3D trackers, and from all of that, put it in the mix, and it's going to try and do a camera solve to recreate its best guess of the camera move from the live action. You can see it's pretty quick in the time it's taken me to say all that. It's almost done. And we get a pixel error of below 1, which is pretty good. If we got something a little bit higher, we could go through and we can use our fine-tuning tools to go through and kind of refine this. Now, what's really nice about this is that if we go to sort of like a point cloud view, you can see that we've actually now got a point cloud in space that's fairly representative of the objects that we're kind of tracking. And if we wanted to, we could actually use some of those points to go through and actually use those as locators in space to which we could attach objects to, which is really nice. You know, if you wanted something kind of sitting on the Christmas tree, we can actually go through and pick out a locator that's going to match that. So maybe actually we're just going to go and do that. Let's go and find one that's looks pretty good. So we're going to kind of select this one, and I'm going to actually create a locator in my scene from that. You can see how we're going to use that in just a second. Go back to my result view for a moment though, and everything looks a little bit kind of messed up. We've got this weird kind of crazy motion because at the moment we're still looking through my default camera, and I actually want to be looking through my 3D camera. So back in my object menu here, if we go to my default camera, and we can change that to my new camera 3D, then we scrub through, everything kind of looks okay. If we go to our top view, we can kind of see exactly what's happening at this stage, is that the background plate is actually attached to the camera movement, so it's all kind of moving synced together. And then the locator that we actually made is then sort of sitting somewhere in space before that. So the idea is, in this respect, is that if we actually attach something onto that locator, then it's obviously going to move in sync with that object, which is kind of quite nice. So I know this is a Christmas tree, but let's just bring out an object. Let's bring out a little bit of 3D text, and we're going to make this nice and Christmassy. We're going to call this tree. That's fairly obvious. And let's make it kind of quite big so we can see it, and also probably just change the color. So we're going to make it a nice, what's going to be a good color for this? A nice bright blue. That's going to stick out. Now, we could of course parent this onto the locator, but actually what's quite nice about this is that we can actually take this object, and if I hold down Shift, I can actually then just snap it to that locator in space. And once again, if we look at our top view for a moment, you can see now what we've got. If we make our 3D text have a little bit of depth, is that is snapped directly onto that locator in space. Now the net result of that is that because it's now locked to a locator in the correct X, Y, and Z space, is that when my camera sort of pans through the scene, it's looked like it's actually sitting on the tree. It's going to kind of move in that sort of spatial environment. Okay, so that's a really good use for using locators to attach an object. We've put a piece of text in, but this could quite easily be a mask. So that's an interesting concept, that we can actually put a Gmask in 3D space attached to a tracking locator. So the last thing we really need to do is drop in our background and sort of position that a little bit back so we get some nice parallax movement. And we're going to come back to my batch schematic for a second. And what I'm going to do is, with my key that I've done previously, I'm just going to kind of hook that up into there. We're going to come back into my schematic, and what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to unhide my background plate. Now at the moment everything is kind of a little bit in the wrong place, so if we kind of look at my top view for a moment, and we can see exactly what the problem is that we've actually got our background here is far too forward in space. So let's just pick that up. We're going to drop that behind the camera. Now we're going to kind of look at this view, and then we're just going to increase the scale of my background plate so it actually fills my scene. Now the other thing I may want to kind of do in this is sort of give it a little bit of a perspective shift, so you can see that as we go through the scene, we actually want to make it big enough that it's going to stay there throughout the whole scene. So it's going to cover my entire camera angle of view. So I probably want to make it a little bit bigger than that. Move it about here, just move it down a bit. So basically we've got enough sort of background plate to cover the whole movement. Now, because this is now positioned slightly different in space, I'm just going to hide my 3D text for a moment. As we kind of pan through, we get this sort of realistic parallax shift, as if we're kind of peering around the corner as we go through with the camera. Does that make sense? Which I hope it does. But you can see it's actually, from that camera motion analysis, we can actually have quite a convincing effect of something that's now sitting outside the window, and as we sort of peer around the Christmas tree, we actually get to see and reveal more of that background. Now we can do some interesting stuff with this. We can actually go through, and on that camera we can attach, because we now have a ZDepth environment, we can actually attach a depth of field node, so we kind of get some realistic defocus as we go, which is quite good. For this, so I've got some predefined outputs. I've got my comp, I've got my background only, and I need a matte. So down here, what's nice is that you can have multiple render layers coming out the same, and I just need to enable the fact that on this particular one, I need to have all these going through as a matte output. So now comp, background, matte. And what that's going to do is, out here, I've actually used a matchbox node that's going to do a light wrap. So this is taking the comp, it's taking the background and the matte separately, and it's creating very quickly for me. I mean, this is the beauty of these Lightbox plugins. It's creating this light wrap map that, when we kind of look at the result, gives this really sort of nice sort of blur and spill of the light as it's kind of coming around here. And it's pretty interactive, you can see, as you kind of go through. It's really sort of changed the level, kind of sells a shot a little bit if it wasn't for my awful key. But once again, like I said, the footage is kind of quite compressed. So that has been an awful lot in one video and one setting. I hope you haven't dozed off and you've kind of enjoyed it. Hope it gives you a really good idea of what you can kind of do with Action and all the tools that are inside. There's a whole bunch of things we haven't touched on, things like importing 3D geometry, doing image-based lighting. But once again, this is just like a bare bones. This is kind of what Action can do. This is how you put stuff together. This is how you do some keying. This is how you do some tracking to get you started. Once again, if we get time, we can probably do some more advanced tutorials on some of the more advanced topics. But just be safe in the knowledge that all those features actually do exist inside of Action. So thanks for watching. It's been really good and exciting going through all these features. Hope you've got something from it and enjoy using Flame.